For years, General Motors was viewed as the styling leader in the American automobile industry, producing such gorgeous vehicles for the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that it had number one position in market share and actually was so large that the government was trying to break off Chevrolet from General Motors because it thought that it had a monopoly. But something changed as the 1970s evolved into the 1980s, and General Motors design lost some of that leadership really and ceded it to a company called Ford across town in Dearborn. Now, what happened during this time frame? In the 1980s, General Motors was still producing some good-looking cars like my 1982 Trans Am, which I still think is a beautiful vehicle. It's unfortunate that the assembly quality and the engineering is quite poor, but gosh darn it, the thing looks absolutely gorgeous. But aside from the sports cars like the Firebird and the Camaro and the Corvette for 1984, all of which I think still have held up well from a design standpoint, the mainstream automobiles from GM, well, particularly the front-wheel drive ones, just didn't have all that much in terms of design flair. They really were typical three-box style designs, all with this vertical backlight that was inspired by the 1976 to 79 Seville success. And GM designers employed that very vertical backlight three-box design on almost every vehicle that they did. If you take a look at General Motors cars of the era, first of all, take a look as an example at this 1985 Buick Electra, you'll notice they all have a very similar style. They have a relatively tall roof with that very vertical C-pillar. They have the belt line below the hood, so the hood kind of raises up, and then there's a dip in the overall side of the vehicle, so there's more glass area. And then some of them have a relatively tall deck lid compared to the belt line, but that's really the style from General Motors in the 1980s. And it actually is pretty similar at Chrysler. And the K car as an example. Very tall upper, very low fender, relatively low quarter panel. Although the Chrysler, I would say, is even a bit boxier than the General Motors cars of the era. But it doesn't matter what GM car you look at from the 1980s. We just saw a 1985 Buick Electra, but take a look here at an N car, an Oldsmobile Calais, something that was considerably smaller. It has kind of the same style and proportion. And if you look at an A car, like you see here, again, you see similar style and proportion. So what really happened? Well, at the time, General Motors design leadership under Irv Rabicki just thought that it was too much of a change for consumers to have them go and try to buy smaller vehicles that looked significantly different from the vehicles that they were exiting. And it was a good thought because, well, perhaps design as well as program planning recognized that the biggest source of buyers for new cars is actually the people who own your existing cars today. It's very hard for auto companies to conquest buyers. In fact, some of the best vehicles that are sold, the conquest rates won't even top 10%. In other words, by a conquest buyer, I mean somebody who turns in a differently branded vehicle from the one that they're buying. It's very, very tough to make that happen. And so it made sense. General Motors, when it downsized its vehicles, really kept a lot of the styling cues from the larger cars. But, the larger cars from General Motors over the course of many years had many different styling cues. They weren't always that three-box design with the vertical backlight. For whatever reason, designers at GM just became enamored with that very vertical C-pillar and kind of this upright design, a very distinctive trunk and a distinctive hood form. No fastbacks aside from, of course, the F cars, the Camaro and Firebird of the time, or let's just say the sportier cars. It also tended to work from a packaging standpoint because those relatively tall roofs and the upright forms of the cars and relatively little tumble home enabled greater passenger compartment space. So I think GM thought it had a winning formula with this design because it enabled relatively large trunk volume, it enabled relatively large interior volume relative to the package size, and it seemingly worked. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of the GM vehicles that were styled like that sold pretty well. The Citation, as an example, when it came out in 1980, it sold 800,000 units in that first model year alone. And yes, it was a bit of an elongated year. Came out in spring of 1979. But it worked on many different cars. The C cars is an example that came out in 1985, very successful. The Olds 98 was the most successful Olds 98 to date from a sales standpoint. But there was a crosstown rival named Ford that had a different philosophy, and this would be an extreme changing of the guard at Ford Motor Company. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at some of the vehicles that were designed at Ford Motor Company in the late 1970s and that were introduced in the early 1980s. First, let's just take a look at the Lincoln Mark VI. One of my least favorite vehicles, I have to say, but I know that there's quite a few fans out there for it. But take a look at how flat the fender profile is, how flat the quarter panel is. And this is the so-called fill the cube design. Push the fenders all the way out, push the quarter panel all the way out. Very vertical forms, perfectly flat belt line, perfectly flat fender tops, no taper to the rear, no taper to the front really. That was Ford design for years, especially in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And that really had come about because of the styling of the 1961 Continental and its relative success during that time frame. Although I would say the 1961 Continental was significantly better looking than the Mark VI. I think the 61 Continental is one of the most beautiful cars of all time, but it does have those very flat fenders, flat quarter panels, but it just has an overall, let's say, organicness to the form. What do I mean by that? It's got just subtle radiuses and curves all over it versus the 1980 Mark VI that really doesn't have any rounded surfaces. It's just all sharp creases. The Lincoln Town Car would be yet another example of this Ford, let's say, style of design of the era. You can tell, just like the Mark VI, very similarly creased. Another element that you can see in the side profile of the Lincoln Town Car is that Ford had this love of symmetric overhangs front and rear that gives this Town Car a very bizarre side profile. But hey, that was the Ford styling of the era, and it sold. The Town Car that you see here and the Panther platform cars, like the LTD and then the Marquis. Later they called it the Grand Marquis when a Fox body Marquis was introduced. Those would be very successful vehicles, and those Panther platform cars displayed similar boxy styling. Even the 1981 Ford Escort and Mercury Lynx, for those who remember the Mercury Lynx, had a number of elements of this Ford style of design associated with them, namely that super flat belt line that graced every single Ford of the Jean Bourdonnais era. It was one of the reasons, for example, why Ford decided that it couldn't have the same Escort in the U.S. and overseas from a styling standpoint. The U.S. styling leader, Jean Bourdonnais, insisted that the U.S. car have a flat belt line. And it's kind of silly because here's the U.S. car, and here is the European car. They look very similar, but it's all different sheet metal between them. But something was afoot at Ford during the early 1980s, and it would really make it the car company to watch during that time frame. First of all, Ford introduced a vehicle called the Ford Sierra overseas, and this was a vehicle designed by Uwe Bonson as well as Patrick Lequemont and championed by Bob Lutz. And you can tell that this was a completely different new direction for Ford from an overseas design perspective, much more aerodynamically influenced over, let's say, the vehicles that it replaced, like the Taurus and Cortina that you see here. Now, the Sierra initially wasn't that much of a success in markets like the UK. It did well in other European markets, but it eventually took off and become one of the best-selling vehicles that Ford produced, and it was produced for many years in Europe. It actually was even brought stateside, for those who remember, as the Mercure XR4 Ti. That was effectively a rebadged Ford Sierra. That was Bob Lutz's idea when he became an executive in Ford North America to import that vehicle. That idea didn't necessarily pan out for a number of reasons, which you can see in another video that's on my channel with Bob. But I think the overall thought was a good one. You have to remember that by the time the Mercure was brought stateside, it was basically an old car. It was 4 model years old. So it was a bit tired too, on top of other challenges that it had. But the Sierra was really a seminal car in the Ford portfolio, and it really represents a stake in the ground in terms of Ford reorienting its design philosophies away from that Jean Bourdonnais fill the cube type style to something much more organic and aerodynamically focused, which is ironic given that the only auto company that had its own wind tunnel in the 1980s was General Motors. And they were producing cars that were arguably far less aerodynamic than Ford. Ford had to use other wind tunnels from other companies, including, I think, Lockheed Martin was one of the tunnels that a lot of auto companies used at the time. So the Sierra comes out in 1982. Then you have the Ford Thunderbird and Mercury Cougar that come out for 1983, the so-called Aerobird. And imagine this Aerobird, the 1983 Aerobird, and contrast it with the 1980 to 82 Thunderbird that immediately preceded it. See the 1980 and 82 Thunderbird here, again, under the Jean Bourdonnais era of style. Very similar to the Lincoln Mark VI, of course, it's the same platform, and similar in style to the Lincoln Town Car, the Panther platform cars. It's just that legacy Ford DNA. But by the time that the 83 Aerobird had come out, as well as the Cougar, styling leadership had changed at Ford, and it was really now under the leadership of Don Kopka and soon-to-be Jack Telnack. And this new breed of design leadership at Ford had a significant affinity for overseas designs. In fact, Jack Telnack had spent a significant fraction of his career overseas, including Ford of Australia as well as Ford of Europe, and he brought that flair back to Ford in the U.S. And the result was really, in the U.S., that first car that defined the new generation of Ford styling. Again, that was the Aerobird for 1983. And again, just looking at this Aerobird for 1983 and contrasting it with the 80 to 82 Thunderbird, you can just imagine the in-house design tension. These are the same design teams, in fact, just led by different leadership that are doing these cars. And imagine the tension that the designers had with their leadership doing a car like the 80 to 82 Thunderbird. It must have just been a really tough, let's say, series of conversations. But designers finally got what they wanted, and that Aerobird just is, to me, still a beautiful car. The front end with the sealed beam headlamps maybe isn't as great as when that was revised in the later 1980s. But the rear three-quarter view with this kind of fastback profile and the sloped deck lid still has a relatively low belt line, the aircraft-style doors that go into the roof. It's a handsome-looking car. And again, you contrast that with what General Motors was producing at the time or what Chrysler was producing at the time. There was nothing like it in terms of what was being produced by the other domestic auto companies. The Cougar now isn't necessarily my favorite, but it does still have that sloped deck lid to it, that kind of upward sloping belt line with the almost, I'll call it inverted rear quarter glass. It looks like it's upside down. I don't know that that's necessarily my favorite. It's not a bad design overall. But then you have the Lincoln Mark VII that came out for 1984, another revolutionary design. Contrast this Mark VII and its looks with, again, that very sloped deck lid, the fastback, almost rear profile, the sealed beam headlamps are gone up front. The 84 Mark VII was the first U.S.-made car that had composite headlamps, and this beautiful grille that still has that heritage from the Mark III and the Mark IV and the Mark V, but does it in such a modern manner. That Mark VII is, I think, a gorgeous car, especially the LSC Mark VIIs. And you compare that to the Mark VI, and you can see, again, that significant revolution, not an evolution in terms of style. So the Thunderbird and the Cougar come out in 1983. The Mark VII comes out in 84. 84 is also the year where the Tempo Topaz come out. And, well, for a car for their size, again, you see that aerodynamically inspired style. Here on this Topaz, you again have those aircraft-style doors into the roof, a rising fender profile. You don't really have the tapered deck lid. You have on the Topaz that you can see here, a very vertical deck lid with vertical tail lamps, but the car still has more of an aerodynamic flair associated with it than some of the GM and Chrysler cars of the era, although it is a bit more conservative, particularly from the rear three-quarter view, than the Aerobird, as an example, or the Mark VII. And then you really have the punctuation mark associated with this new style design when the Taurus and Sable come out for 1986. Revolutionary vehicles that some would say are kind of copies of the Audis from a few years prior. But I think that, well, if you're going to, as General Motors design vice president Bill Mitchell once said, you're going to don't rob from a grocery store, rob from a bank. And that Audi was an absolutely gorgeous car. And the Ford Taurus and the Mercury Sable were beautiful vehicles, inside and out. They were revolutionary on the interiors as well. Very European style instruments. They had the rotary knobs for the HVAC controls, something that most Americans were used to, the slider bars. And overall, they were relatively successful. And so that really put Ford on the styling map for the 1980s. And they frankly blew the doors off of GM and Chrysler. From what I've heard, when the Taurus and Sable in particular came out in 1986, that really convinced General Motors that it had to do something different. And it also coincided with the changing of the guard at GM design, because Irv Rybicki would retire in 1986. He had been GM styling leader since Bill Mitchell's retirement in 1977, so his tenure lasted from 1977 to 1986. And Chuck Jordan would become the new GM styling vice president from 1986 all the way through to 1992. And that is the era of General Motors design where you can see GM getting away from that three-box style design and cars with sharp creases to cars where, let's just say, the form is the design of the car. A lot of these so-called no-line cars, in other words, very minimal, if any, creases, like the Buick Reatta, concept cars like the Pontiac Banshee, one of my favorites of all time, would come out during this era under Chuck Jordan's leadership. Even a car like the Oldsmobile Aurora was one that was designed under Chuck Jordan's leadership. A completely different styling philosophy that was really opened up by the fact that Ford introduced that 1986 Taurus and Sable and told GM design leadership that they had to do something different, that they were falling behind. And so you have a lot of cars from GM in that late 80s, early 90s era that start to show a new design philosophy, and I think in some cases a very beautiful design philosophy. The early 90s F cars would be another one that would be a distinct departure from the F cars prior. Very organic form, no line kind of car, and also quite beautiful. And I think those designs have held up during even the modern era. But all of that was a result of what Ford did with the vehicles that I mentioned, the 83 Thunderbird Cougar, the 84 Mark 7, the 84 Tempo Topaz, the 86 Taurus and Sable. And it even took Chrysler a little bit longer, but arguably that was what kind of propelled Chrysler to success in the early 90s when it introduced the LH cars and drove it to perhaps introduce the Chrysler Portofino concept in the late 1980s that was a harbinger of the LH cars to come. And bear in mind, who was at Chrysler during this time frame? Well, Lee Iacocca had come from Ford as well as Bob Lutz. And Bob Lutz had a significant influence on the design teams at the time and the European-style influence that he wanted in the cars that Chrysler would introduce in the 1990s. So Ford not only kind of brought about its own success in the 80s, but it exported talent to Chrysler that brought about Chrysler's success in the 90s and made Chrysler really the next design car company, or the car company that designers wanted to work for in the subsequent decade. But it all started back with Ford in the 1980s. Now, what do you think of Ford designs in the 1980s? Do you prefer the Gene Bourdonnais, Phil the Cube era style? Or do you prefer the Jack Telnack era of style with the more aerodynamic vehicles? Put a comment in the comments section and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.